Canada has 100% tariffs right now on Chinese electric vehicles, and that's good for the Ontario auto industry. But China responded with tariffs on Canadian canola.
It started with quiet moves that few outside policy circles even noticed. While Washington ramped up tariffs and threats against Canada's auto industry, another player stepped in with a different tone. Beijing reached out, offering to relax limits on Canadian crops, open its doors to energy and minerals, and even explore partnerships in the booming electric vehicle market. For generations, Canada's trade pulse beat in rhythm with the United States. Nearly 3/4 of everything it exports still heads south across that border. But as the Trump administration tightened the screws with new duties on metals, furniture, and vehicles, a realization began to take hold in Ottawa. Depending so heavily on one partner had become a risk. Instead of fighting back through confrontation, Canada shifted course, seeking opportunity where few expected it. Could America's pressure be the push that sends Canada into China's orbit? In early October, tension between Washington and Ottawa reached a breaking point. At a Toronto Business Forum, U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick declared that in vehicle production, it would be America first, Canada second. The remark was not empty talk. Behind it stood a looming 25% tariff on cars and auto parts shipped from Canada to the United States. For Ontario, the heart of Canada's auto belt, that announcement struck deep. Nearly 500,000 jobs in southern Ontario rely on the auto supply chain, a system tightly linked to factories across Michigan, Ohio, and Illinois. Every car assembled north of the border contains around half of its components made in the United States. The two economies function as extensions of each other, but the tariff threat meant that Link was in danger. By the time Lutnick's comments reached the headlines, investors had already begun to worry. Ottawa's trade analysts warned that such a tax could slash tens of billions of dollars from Canada's auto exports and spark mass layoffs across the steel, aluminum, and manufacturing sectors. Even US experts admitted that the move would drive up production costs for American automakers. Still, Donald Trump's administration stood firm. The message was unmistakable. Production should shift to US soil, regardless of the collateral damage. That moment marked the beginning of a quiet but decisive shift in Canada's trade strategy. For years, Ottawa had followed Washington's lead, supporting its ally on a series of measures, including tariffs against China's electric vehicles. Yet instead of receiving gratitude, Canada was hit with penalties of its own. Trump's brand of economic nationalism had little room for partnership. His administration viewed trade as a contest of winners and losers. While Washington raised barriers, Beijing took note and made a move few anticipated. China began signaling that it was open to dialogue. Senior officials reached out to Canadian counterparts to discuss easing restrictions on agricultural imports and expanding cooperation in clean energy technology. For a country still facing China's tariffs on canola, this was a notable gesture. According to trade analysts, Beijing's offer was direct. Canada could reopen its market to Chinese electric vehicles, priced between $35,000 and $40,000 Canadian dollars, and in return, China would relax limits on Canadian farm exports. The proposal made economic sense. Canadian consumers would gain affordable EV options, while farmers would regain access to a market of over 1 billion people. The timing was deliberate. With the United States blocking Chinese EVs through 100% tariffs, Beijing sought new ground, and Canada's growing frustration with Washington created that opening. Inside Ottawa, policymakers recognized both opportunity and risk. Diversifying trade could strengthen Canada's economy and send a signal that loyalty to the US could not come at the cost of national stability. China was not replacing the United States, but it was offering something Washington had taken away: a genuine choice. By mid-October, Canada's pivot began to take shape. Prime Minister Mark Carney's government unveiled fresh funding for manufacturing, steel, and energy sectors. The Finance Ministry announced programs to cushion industries affected by US tariffs, and Ontario's Premier Doug Ford called for new protections for auto workers. Publicly, the tone toward Washington remained measured but firm. Canada lifted certain retaliatory tariffs to encourage dialogue while maintaining a 25% levy on US vehicles entering Canada. That stance was calculated. It sent the message that Canada was willing to talk, but unwilling to bow. Officials referred to the approach as sectoral resilience. Instead of relying on one sweeping free trade agreement, Canada began pursuing smaller focused partnerships in steel, aluminum, agriculture and electric vehicles with a variety of nations. China's outreach aligned perfectly with that plan. Canadian suppliers in the EV and battery industries were already exploring Asia for investment, and Chinese companies were seeking access to critical minerals such as nickel and lithium from northern Ontario. What emerged was not defiance, but pragmatism. Cooperation offered benefits for both economies, and Canada's diplomats described the new direction as building a network of equals. Trump's aggressive tactics only fueled that momentum. His tariffs meant to protect US industry were beginning to backfire. Data from the US Department of Commerce showed that the cost of steel and aluminum had surged nearly 20% since early 2025. Auto prices climbed, factory profits thinned, and production lines in the Great Lakes states began to slow. In Michigan, Ohio, and Wisconsin, companies reliant on cross-border parts were hit hardest. Economists from the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago estimated that every 10% rise in tariff costs cut manufacturing output in the Midwest by roughly 2%. For Washington, the long-term consequences are becoming clear. Instead of rebuilding trust with allies, the White House has managed to fracture it. Canada's engagement with China signals that the United States can no longer assume its northern neighbor's full dependence. By tightening its grip, America has weakened its hold. Ottawa's moves are not acts of rebellion, but of adaptation. Confronted with barriers on steel, aluminum, and vehicles, Canada chose precision over protest. It diversified its markets, safeguarded its industries, and strengthened its independence. The effects are beginning to show. Exports to Asian markets are slowly rising. Trade talks with China continue, and within Canada, a quiet realization is spreading. Economic survival cannot depend on a single partner. Trump's hardline campaign has exposed a deeper truth. True influence cannot be maintained through threats. While Washington measures strength in tariffs, Canada is learning to measure it in flexibility. If Ottawa's cooperation with Beijing continues to expand, the United States may lose more than contracts or factories. It could lose the trust that once defined its leadership. The original goal of Trump's tariff war was to make America strong again. But in many ways, it is strengthening everyone else's resolve instead. Washington claims that hundreds of billions of dollars are flowing into the country, but the global response tells another story. Across the Pacific, the same pattern of pressure is eroding relationships built over decades. Japan and South Korea, two of America's closest allies in Asia, are showing clear signs of frustration. Both nations have been long-standing economic partners, but the tone has shifted. What began as cooperation is now tension. In Tokyo, government officials have publicly expressed unease. Japan's economic minister announced that the trade agreement with Washington remains unsettled. While the US reduced auto tariffs from 25% to 15%, the crucial deals covering pharmaceuticals and semiconductors remain incomplete. Without them, Japan insists, there can be no final agreement. Behind closed doors, the conflict runs deeper. Washington has demanded that Japan invest roughly 550 billion yen to help rebuild US manufacturing in key industries such as shipbuilding and pharmaceuticals. To American officials, it is an investment in shared prosperity. To Tokyo, it feels like a demand. Japanese policymakers fear that paying billions to secure lower tariffs risks setting a dangerous precedent, one that blurs the line between fair trade and tribute. Business leaders echo those concerns. They describe the agreement as opaque